Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered his army to repel Ukrainian troops from the country's territory.
Some 120,000 people have been evacuated from the border region in Kursk after Ukraine launched a surprise offensive last week. More are being moved inland from Belgorod, which neighbors Kursk, amid fears the Ukrainian incursion could expand.
The development marks the most significant incursion by foreign troops into Russia since the Second World War. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the situation purely a security issue, capturing areas from which the Russian army struck into Ukraine. Now, he said Moscow must be forced into peace if its leader wants to continue waging war. Now, we're joined by Donald Jensen. He's a senior advisor of Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's also a former diplomat at U.S. Embassy Moscow. Mr. Jensen, thank you very much for your time. Firstly, I just want to ask you, why now? What is Ukraine trying to get out of this? And is their strategy working?
Well, Ukraine has a couple of goals. Number one would be take the initiative on the battlefield from the Russians, who have had it for 6 months or possibly more. And you can do that best when you're outnumbered by surprising the enemy. And that's exactly what they have. All along the front, the Russians are on the back foot, as they say. The Russians are trying to adjust to scrambling. They're cut off guard. They're refugees. There's actually a lot of chaos on the Russian side. So that's their first goal. Take the initiative, put the Russians on the defensive, because the battle, the fighting in Donbass, not far away to the south, is very bloody for both sides. And that is, in that area, the Russians are slowly gaining kilometer by kilometer, but the Ukrainians are also putting up a good fight there. Second alternative would be to, in case there are negotiations, and we're a long ways from that, but in case there are negotiations, if Ukraine can somehow hold on to this salient, this land that they've taken, that might be useful down the line if it occurs at the negotiating table to trade back to Russia, for example, for Crimea. But I would stress this is a major blow to Vladimir Putin politically, especially above all. He has been almost arrogant. You saw how angry he was today at the meeting in Moscow. So Ukraine has those three goals. Take the initiative, use it possibly for negotiations later on. And third, to humiliate Vladimir Putin politically, a man who's inflicted so much loss, so much bloodshed, so much hardship on the Ukrainian people. So far, so good. I think the Ukrainians have to be careful of a number of things because this could go the wrong way. But for now, Russia remains defensive, somewhat chaotic, and frankly, humiliated in the world.
Mm-hmm. You raised a lot of interesting points there, and I was listening to a podcast you were on yesterday. You described Russia's command and control as a mess, and that doesn't make for effective military action. What impact is the Kursk incursion going to have on Moscow's efforts on other fronts, such as in the Kyiv region?
Well, that's an excellent question. First of all, the Ukrainian army is trained along Western lines. Local commanders, low-level commanders, lieutenants are flexible. They adapt to situations. They take weapons from the ground that the Russians have abandoned, convert them to their purposes. The Russians are rigid, hierarchical, difficult to change. They don't seem to learn from their mistakes. But the key issue is just what you asked. Will the Ukrainians be able to drain troops away from the Donbass front to deal with the situation in the north? And frankly, I've looked at a lot of reports today. It's too early to tell. The Russians have moved some troops away from the fighting in the south and in the east to bolster the front around Kursk. Whether that will divert enough troops away from Donbass, where the Russians have their major offensive, it remains to be seen. And frankly, it's a little too early to tell. It depends how things go in the next couple of days.
You touched on this a moment ago, the argument that's been put forward that this incursion is an attempt at a bargaining chip, to gain leverage in possible ceasefire talks with Moscow. How much closer are we to peace negotiations at this point? Is it time for dialogue between the two sides?
Well, I would say we're quite a bit further away. And the problem is, number one, the positions are so far apart from each other. Ukraine wants to keep its independence. Russia wants to annihilate Ukraine. There's not really much to talk about. And the second problem is something that we in the West people in Singapore, elsewhere, always make, I think, is that the Russians see negotiations as not a means to have a settlement. They see negotiations as a tool to get what they want, a tool for victory. So as you say in the United States, we believe in win-win. The Russians don't. They believe in win and you lose. And that means that their strategy, their tactics in negotiations are quite a bit different. And that means there's a huge gap between the two sides. I wouldn't expect that to happen anytime soon unless one side or the other collapses on the battlefield. But for now, I would not be very hopeful. I think for now, we're going to have to be quite a while if there are ever negotiations at all. So we have to see. Putin could change his mind after the past few days, but by all indications, Putin is hardening his resolve to win, and that means no talks.
Mr. Jensen, you earlier said that the Ukrainians should be careful because, I mean, certainly a bold and audacious operations they did there. So what are the risks? What are you most worried about?
Well, the risks are considerable. Number one, in Donbass, as I said, to the south and east, Ukraine is fighting at a 1-3 disadvantage. If you lose troops in Kursk, where they are now, then you run the risk of weakening that front. And that front, in many ways, is more important, more critical for Ukraine than the Kursk area is where they are now. That's number one. And second, if you look at the map, you'll see that Ukraine is in what they call a salient. They've gone so far to the east that they're, to some extent, exposed both in the north and below them in the south. And that gives the Russians an opportunity to encircle them, to push back, and frankly, to even cut off some of the Ukrainian forces. I'm sure the Ukrainian military commanders are used to this. It's sort of a classic battlefield problem. But Ukraine cannot get too much into the enthusiasm of what it's achieved in the past 7 days. It's got to be serious. It's got to be careful. And frankly, we don't know whether they want to move very much further. They could consolidate what they have. They could pull back across the border. And that will be determined later on, I think, this week. There's a lot of possibilities and a lot of scenarios underway. But the Ukrainians have to be careful not to get carried away with their success, not to allow themselves to be surrounded, and above all, not to weaken the front down in Donbass, which is a much more critical battle space for them and even for the Russians from their point of view.
Last year, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive. It failed, and those on the ground have described this war as slow, as grinding. What message is this incursion going to send to Ukraine's Western allies, and is it going to have any impact on morale? You did say they shouldn't get too excited.
Oh, it's gotten a lot of people in the West excited. You're right, again, another good question. The so-called offensive last summer was much publicized, much anticipated. Everybody knew it was coming, and the Russians were ready. This time, as you saw last week, surprise. Everybody was taken by surprise, especially the Russians. Ukrainians have made great use of speed, of their better training, despite their smaller numbers, speed, their better training, their Western high-tech weapons. It's really been a classic incursion. But again, it's only an incursion right now. We don't know whether it'll be a permanent occupation of the territory in Russia. And another game changer, of course, was the fact that the West has allowed Ukrainians to use their weapons that they have given them inside the Russian Federation to attack areas where Russia has been hiding, as it were, troops to counterattack into Ukraine. Now, Ukraine can hit them, and now that they have the ability to hit them, you see what difference it makes. Finally, on morale, this is a great lift to all of my Ukrainian friends, to the Ukrainian armed forces. Just look at the video. The Russians are so demoralized, they're raiding their own fellow Russians' stores, housing, and all that. That's a sign of desperation. And Putin, if he wants to stop this, has to move quickly. He's got to shore up that morale on the Russian side. And right now, it's in really, really very bad shape.
All right, Mr. Jensen, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your expertise this morning. Donald Jensen, Senior Advisor on Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace.